Tras romper relaciones diplomáticas con Taiwán, el gobierno de Daniel Ortega
Beijing has its eyes fixed on commercial opportunities in South America.
中国不断提升与拉丁美洲国家的合作关系。
En su gira por Latinoamérica, el presidente Xi Jinping
我们只有勇于自我革命，才能赢得历史主动。
Hello from Barcelona. My name is Monika Prusinowska, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's episode. You parsifal for your kind invitation. As a word of self-introduction, I am currently a Ramon y Cajal Fellow at the University of Barcelona Law Faculty, Public International Law Department. My work perspective has been shaped by nearly a decade of experience in China, where I studied, researched, and practiced Chinese law and its interaction with the legal systems. I dedicate my work to fostering more informed dialogue with China for both academia and practitioners, focusing on the issues of legal engagement. A part of my current research agenda is looking at the legal issues surrounding the presence of Chinese investors in Latin America. Today, we have a great pleasure to have with us Ning Leng. Ning is an assistant professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy, Georgetown University. She's currently a Wilson China Fellow at the Wilson Center. Ning received her PhD in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2018 and was a postdoc at Harvard University's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. Ning specializes in comparative politics with a focus on political economy, authoritarian institutions, and Chinese politics and economy. Her current book, Politicizing Business: How Firms Are Made to Serve the Party State in China, reveals how the Chinese state solicits political services from the companies, resulting in an unstable investment environment and unintended development outcomes. Even more relevant for us today, Ling is currently conducting her fieldwork on the successes and failures of Chinese companies in South America. On the top of that, before her academic career, Ning was a management consultant in Chicago, specializing in strategic and operations. And she will bring the wealth of her experience to us. Ning, welcome. It's an immense pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much, Monika. Thank you for having me on Cafe and Seda podcast. I'm very excited to be here.
Wonderful. Let's not waste more time. Let's get to know a little bit more about you. To start, could you please share a bit about your professional journey and in particular, how your work and research have led you to focus on the connection between China and Latin America?
Absolutely. So I always focus on Chinese business. My first book is about how Chinese state controls Chinese companies. So after I finished my first book, I was wondering what should be my next big project. And here I combine my professional interest in Chinese companies and my personal interest in Latin America. I've been traveling to the region for years now, and I've been to 11 countries. I love the region. So I thought Latin America is the next destination for Chinese companies. I'm going to combine my professional and personal interest and follow them and see how well they do in a new region.
Wonderful. So perhaps to start with your first book, could you tell us a little bit more about it? I remember, as we mentioned, it's called Politicizing Business: How Firms Are Made to Serve the Party State in China. And if you could focus for us on the relevance of the findings of this book in the context of the presence of Chinese firms in the region of Latin America.
Absolutely. In this book, what I discovered is that Chinese government has systematically used companies for political goals in China. And this is nothing new. This did not happen after Xi Jinping took power in 2013. This has been a pattern of Chinese political economy model ever since 1978. So what do the Chinese government, local governments and central government use companies for? There are a lot of familiar political services that they demand of the companies. For example, we know employment is a big one, surveillance is another big one, censorship, all of these are done through companies. But I also uncovered two more political services that fewer people know about. that the companies provide to the Chinese government. The first political services is that the companies would directly be involved in helping local government officials to get promotion. Beyond the obvious buying and selling offices, companies also take on the project, what I call visibility projects, which are large-scale infrastructure projects that will help Chinese government officials become more visible in the political system. So there's a little bit background about how Chinese government promotes officials here that might be useful for the audience to know. It's an authoritarian country, and we all know that in authoritarian countries, rulers suffer from this dilemma where they have to choose both the loyal people and the competent people. But loyalty and competence at the top level, these two qualities do not necessarily coexist. In fact, a lot of the times they contradict each other. The most loyal people cannot be the most competent, and the most competent people cannot be the most loyal. And so what the Chinese Communist Party has been doing ever since the 1970s is that they are trying to incorporate both qualities into a decision to promote any local official. In this process, they installed the system to evaluate local government officials. One part of the system is subjective evaluation, where the party committee will simply watch a local government official and say, this person is loyal, this person is good, this person toes the party line. And then there's another part of the system that tries to measure the competence of local government officials. And this is a very quantitative evaluation system. For example, the government will say, the party committee will say, here is a goal for you, local government officials, GDP growth next year. Here's another goal for you, unemployment rate next year. You have to meet all of these policy goals. Now, in reality, this dual system of evaluation created a lot of confusion and anxiety among Chinese government officials. They don't know how to showcase themselves in this dual evaluated system. Like, should they do a lot of extra work to show that they're competent? But if they do a lot of extra work, would that make them look like they are not loyal and they're not towing the party line? So local government officials suffer from this anxiety of, how do we get noticed by the party and get promoted? Eventually, what the government officials invent, and I think this is a very smart strategy, is to basically overdo whatever the party wants them to do. So for example, for a long time, the party wants all of the local government officials to develop infrastructure, airports, bridges, right, for logistics. And the government officials simply say, then we're going to overdo it. We're going to build an airport that is 4 times over capacity. We're going to build a wastewater treatment plant that's 5 times over capacity. So this project will be noticeable. It will be visible to our boss up there. But overdoing projects means they need to spend money. They need to spend a lot of money on these grand, extravagant, visible projects. So who is going to pay for these projects? It's the companies. So this is the first political services that companies provide to local government officials. I call them visibility projects. Now, in this process, here's the interesting thing about company ownership. State-owned companies in China, so these are companies that are directly owned and managed by the Chinese government through this institution called SASAC, State Asset. I need to spell out SASAC. So it's directly owned by this government agency. And state-owned enterprises have a soft budget constraint, meaning that they are not really constrained by how much they could spend. And so state-owned enterprises now have an advantage in building visibility projects for the local government officials. Private companies, meaning they are owned by private citizens in China, they have hard budget constraints. These companies do not have unlimited budget, and they cannot easily take out loans from the banks like state-owned enterprises do. So they are limited in how much they can sponsor visibility projects. So in this process, we notice that gradually, if a sector is chosen by a local government official to start these, career promoting projects, gradually, private companies will lose to state-owned enterprises in sponsoring these huge visible projects. So private companies will start to disappear if a sector is selected by government officials to launch visibility projects. So that's the first part of the political services I describe in the book. And there's a second part of political services in China that companies directly provide to governments, and somehow not many people know about this, which is companies directly help government to appease or coerce or suppress protest. So we know that protests happen a lot in China, and we know the roles of governments. We know the role of thugs from, for example, Lin Leong's, work. But governments also recruit companies to directly deal with protest, particularly when these companies are involved in building sensitive projects. For example, a chemical plant that could produce pollution, for example, waste incineration that could release dioxin into the air. When protests happen against these sensitive projects, what eventually happens is the government will say, we don't want to take on the responsibility. We don't want to show the public that we, the government, started the project. We must let the company take on responsibilities. So what do companies do in the face of protest? Here is when company ownership again comes out to play a difference. Private companies are particularly good in playing the role of scapegoat. What they would do is they would shoulder all of the responsibility for pollutions coming from a project, for, substandard construction quality, and they're going to pay the protesters. They give money, and they might offer protesters jobs in the private companies, and they will shoulder all of the responsibility for the government. But state-owned enterprises are particularly good at directly suppressing protests because state-owned enterprises have the backing of Chinese government, particularly large state-owned enterprises, the central government-owned ones, the 97 companies that we see everywhere in the world. They could directly work with provincial governments or even national governments to mobilize, for example, paramilitary force in China to suppress protest. So what I notice is that in providing these political services, companies take on the responsibility for the government. So the government is shielded from blame. And state-owned enterprises are particularly good at suppressing large-scale protests. But private companies are better for smaller protests because they would just pay off the protesters. And so in a sector where more and more large protests emerge, we also see the phenomenon of private companies losing out to state-owned enterprises, and they just exit the sector. And these sectors then become state-dominated. So the implication of this book is basically that as, this Chinese political economy model continues, that all of these government officials are allowed to conscript companies for political services. If this continue to go on, what we will see is that state-owned enterprises in China would dominate more and more sectors compared to private companies. And so this is intriguing to me because I wonder, what if when the companies go abroad? When they go abroad and they start infrastructure projects, do they play the same two kind of roles for the Chinese government? So this is what motivates me to start my second book about Chinese companies in Latin America.
Indeed, it's a fascinating research. I have a question, one observation, perhaps even before I go to the question. I think for our audience, it actually can be quite new to hear that there is quite significant amount of social intervention in terms of protesting, in terms of voicing disagreement around the projects, whether for environmental issues, labor issues, or any other issues. Because oftentimes when we talk about this aspect, it's clearly visible in the context of investors in Latin America, but I think it's not that widely showcased in the context of what happens within China. So it's a very interesting finding in itself. The question I have is whether you already see, I know it might be early in your research, but any of the patterns that can be extrapolated to the Chinese investment abroad, and especially we would like to focus today on the region of Latin America. Do you see certain tendencies that have been observed within China that might already be also observable in the context of Chinese investment abroad and the role of state-owned enterprises in Latin America?
I think the first thing I see on the ground in Latin America is that when Chinese companies go abroad, be it state-owned enterprises or private, they really are not familiar with how to deal with protest and confrontation in a democratic setting. If you think about what these companies, Chinese companies, do at home, right? State-owned enterprises know how to suppress. Private companies know how to co-opt with money. But when they go into democracies, what they really need to do is negotiation, make concessions, reach a deal with the protesters against their projects. And neither type of Chinese companies are very experienced in doing that. And so what I'm realizing is that private companies continue to hope, they can co-opt protesters, and they resort less to local governments in a foreign country. But state-owned enterprises probably would demand more of the local governments, the host country governments, to work with the state-owned enterprises together to suppress protests. And they're oftentimes very disappointed in realizing that democratic governments just would not necessarily do it for a company, let alone a Chinese company. So what I see is that they are both Chinese state-owned enterprises and private companies are still in a learning process of how to deal with protests, and they have taken on different approaches. Now, which type of companies will be more successful? I think that is a question that I cannot yet answer, but I'm very much hoping to find out.
Wonderful. Ning, and do you feel that already there is an increased awareness and tendency to deal with the issue of potential social discontentment at the early stage of the projects, at the stage of due diligence, at the stage of initiating the projects? Because as we know, commonly the problem frequently appears with Chinese investors in the middle of the project. There might be already ongoing works, and then the bomb explodes. And as we know, especially in the countries where the social license is a very important element, it might be already too late to deal with the problem. Do you see, as obviously the Chinese investors are also learning over the time, do you see the tendency to already envision the problems and address them upfront by any means?
I think they're definitely trying to do that. For example, a lot of Chinese companies now would have the social responsibility system, corporate social responsibility system in place. But what I also see is that their effort at this point still remains superficial. A lot of them, again, are visibility projects, right? They're going to build, for example, a women's learning center, and they just have these indigenous women go there, but they don't provide job opportunities. They do not help build up a supply chain for what these indigenous women might be producing, be it textile, be it agriculture products. They don't have a long-term thinking. They're doing very superficial, temporary work to try to just build up a reputation that says, look, we care. But they don't know how to care because they never had that practice in China. They also believe, I think Chinese companies probably are overconfident in the power of money. They are actually willing to pay, right? Pay the workers, and when the workers are unhappy, improve their lunch or dinner, right? I heard this from some companies. But they don't understand that sometimes, particularly in countries with democracy and tradition of labor movements, they need to take labor conditions seriously. They actually need to have systematic change. And I don't yet see a lot of efforts on these fronts. So I think Chinese companies are very much still at the beginning of adapting to a different political and social environment.
Where the powerful tools that they know back from home might not be necessarily effective. And to the contrary, they might be a recipe for a disaster in the different context of Latin America. One more question on that point. Do you feel that there is an increased amount of the cooperation with local staff in terms of understanding what happens and what should happen on the ground in the countries where the Chinese investors invest? Or is it still more, let us figure out internally?
They definitely hire more local staff over time. The problem is not at the highest level of management. Usually local staff get promoted to mid-level in a company and that will be it. But sometimes if you want to have, really a long game in a different market, they need to hire local people at the highest level. But here there is a problem of politics. The Communist Party, particularly in state-owned enterprises, they cannot trust, to have local people at the highest level. So that is a dilemma for them, and I don't think they could necessarily resolve that.
Hmm. That's very interesting. And I think it works in a rather ineffective way in both directions, because the voices that I hear from Latin America would be that it's also difficult for us to communicate with the Chinese side because they don't really have this local expertise and local understanding, right? So it's probably desirable to improve in both directions for better communication and understanding. And I think you're absolutely right that it might be particularly relevant for the state-owned enterprises because the stakes and concerns are different. And if we will be observing this tendency that in a way practically state-owned enterprises might be playing continuously increasing role, coupled with the economic factors that we probably could discuss for another hour, that will be interesting tendency to observe. All right. So I wish you best of luck with continuing this research. And now let me move on to the topic that you presented together with Claudia Martinez during your recent presentation in Barcelona during the conference that we had in February this year. Uh, you delve into the legal challenges faced by, again, Chinese state-owned enterprises in their infrastructure projects in the country of Peru. So we are traveling now specifically to Peru for the sake of our discussion. Could you please unpack for us what are these legal challenges that Chinese SOEs face specifically in Peru?
Absolutely. My co-author, Claudia Martinez, brilliant co-author, and she's a lawyer, so she deals with all of these legal matters on a day-to-day basis. And what we are researching about is this very interesting problem on the ground for both the Peruvian government and Chinese companies, which is a legal matter. The question is, should the Peruvian government treat all of the Chinese state-owned enterprises as if they belong to the same mother group? Are they in the same corporation? So the implication, the importance of this question is as follows.
If I can just help decode that for our audience, why would we make an assumption, because this is one of the arguments in your research, that indeed Chinese SOEs should belong to the same economic group, to the same unit, when we talk about allowing them or not allowing them to participate in the bidding processes to obtain the contract? What would be the key argument that why indeed we should classify them as one?
Exactly.
Because of the Chinese state involvement?
Yes. So as mentioned before, there are 97 central Chinese government-owned companies. These state-owned enterprises are all managed by this one agency in China called SASAC, the State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission of the Chinese State Council. So for the Peruvian government, their question is, what is SASAC? Does SASAC control and manage all of these 97 state-owned enterprises on the ground? Does that mean the Peruvian government should treat these 97 state-owned enterprises as branches of the same company and the headquarters will be Chinese government? Or should the Peruvian government consider Chinese company law, which says differently, which says even though these state-owned enterprises are categorized under SASAC, but they still have independent decision-making power and they have, independent operations on the ground. Now, to the Peruvian government, this is a very important question because particularly in the infrastructure sector, we constantly see multiple Chinese construction companies, these are all state-owned enterprises, going into the same tender. They are all competing for the same public contract. Is this competition between independent companies, or is there collusion between different branches of the same headquarters, which is the Chinese government? So the Peruvian government became very concerned about the competition law, anti-monopoly laws, and they don't know how to categorize these Chinese companies. This is a very much ongoing legal struggle on the Peruvian side. So my brilliant co-author again, Claudia Martinez, was pulling out all of these legal documents in Peru. And basically right now, the definition of the same economic group, which is the headquarters of all of these companies, the same economic group will be defined as if this economic group has control over all of the companies under the economic group. But Peru never really specified what is control. Now, let's think about the relationship between SASAC, the Chinese government agency, managing all of these 97 state-owned enterprises. They have several power over these Chinese state-owned enterprises. Number one, they control the personnel management. They promote and demote and move executives of all of these 97 state-owned enterprises. And the second power they have is they retain the power to restructure any state-owned enterprises should time needs it. So in other words, they can split a state-owned enterprises into two. They could force two state-owned enterprises to merge. Now, by these definitions, we could say, right, SASAC has control over Chinese state-owned enterprises, and all of these state-owned enterprises should be considered as subsidiaries or branches that belong to the same economic group. This is the problem for Peru. But if they do not allow Chinese companies to compete with each other because they belong to the same economic group, then there will be visibly, salient less competition and companies participating in Peru's infrastructure building. So it's a very much ongoing struggle. And in our work, we basically try to present where does this dilemma, this legal problem come from. On the Chinese side, the laws are unclear, which makes it very difficult for the Peruvian government to understand Chinese companies and their relationship with the government as well.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the stakes that the state of Peru is balancing here, what are the interests? Because I obviously understand one of the points you raised, well, competition generally is good, at least among the Chinese companies in this sense. And I imagine that generally attracting more of the Chinese investment is at least partly an interest of Peru. But what are other stakes that the state is balancing here in terms of balancing pros and cons of each of the solutions practically?
Absolutely. So what you just described is what the Peruvian government is concerned about. They don't want Chinese companies to exit the Peruvian market. So there is incentive to say these Chinese state-owned enterprises are independent from each other. But the other side to Peru is that if they indeed say, right, these are independent companies, the concern then is the Chinese companies will start collude with each other, and gradually they will win all of the public bids and squeeze out other companies, Peruvian companies, Spanish companies, and then eventually the Chinese companies might potentially monopolize infrastructure building in Peru through collusion. So that is the cons for Peruvian government.
Now, this is indeed a great dilemma, how to deal with that, how to keep the competition healthy, how to keep the reasonable encouragement of the investment. And I think there are ongoing developments, like with the port of Shanghai, that probably make the situation even more complicated recently. So there's definitely the space to watch. And obviously, this is one general overarching question about the competition within Latin America when it comes to public projects, given already a significant presence of Chinese enterprises, right? And obviously, these are not only the concerns unique within the region of Latin America. A couple of years ago, we had a similar case in Poland, where I am originally from, where there was a case of building a highway for the purposes of a Euro football cup. And there was a question of to what extent do we want to permit the entrance of the Chinese companies? So there is a layer of this problem that is universal. But obviously, we see here that the legal layer of what you are discussing, and it definitely will be interesting to see how the situation will evolve in terms of the decision that will be made in any of the directions here.
And this is clearly a common problem right now in Latin America. In Colombia, very recently, in the bidding for Bogota's second line of Bogotá Metro, 2 Chinese companies and Spanish companies participated. And then eventually the Colombian government decided that these 2 Chinese companies, 2 separate Chinese state-owned enterprises, actually they do belong to the same economic group. So they cannot compete at the same time. So they eventually they revoked the qualification for one of the Chinese companies to compete in the bidding. So only one Chinese company.
If I may interrupt here, how is the decision made? Who gets excluded? Because that's interesting, because if I understand correctly, of course, we might be having the situation of potential collusion, cooperation among the Chinese companies. But on the other hand, from different sectors, and especially strategic minerals that I work on, I oftentimes hear that it's not necessarily the cooperation among the Chinese companies. And to the contrary, it's rather a competition. So in the instance, following up on that, if there is a finding that indeed there is a risk of collusion and therefore we will only keep one of the Chinese companies, like in the instance you quoted in the context of Colombia, who gets excluded, who stays in the game?
That is a great question. I actually don't know how they decide which company to exclude, but the evidence that they use to say these two Chinese companies belong to the same group is that they have cross-investor relationship. So the companies invested in each other. That is the evidence. Great question, though. I should look into why one of them got excluded. But you're absolutely right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I want to follow up to say that it's true that Chinese state-owned enterprises very much compete with each other because the executives of these companies need to show that we're doing better than other state-owned enterprises. So we got noticed by Beijing. We got promoted by Beijing. And we know, like, these are evidence coming from Africa that, for example, the China oil corporations, the two largest ones, absolutely competed with each other. They had a turf war in Sudan to fight for oil field exploration. And so it is a complicated relationship among these state-owned enterprises for sure.
I think it's also very relevant for our discussion to indeed stress it that there is a variety of circumstances surrounding Chinese investors within one region, that it might be competition, it might be cooperation, there might be instances of collusion, and as you say, there might be also the instances of cruel competition among them, and therefore it's relevant to, in general, acknowledge that there is heterogeneity among the Chinese players in any of the respects possible, whether they are SOEs, private capital, but even within and among the SOEs, there are also different scenarios, differences when it comes to the level of performance, experience, and also the dynamics between the specific companies, whether SOEs or not, within one particular interest sector region.
Right.
Okay, wonderful. I'm sure we'll hear more from you in the future on that topic. But meanwhile, let me move on to one more current work that I came across. And that is about perception of Chinese investment in the global South, which is fascinating because already a part of our discussion today shows that there is a lot of conceptions and misconceptions in both directions. Oftentimes we say China, Chinese investors, without acknowledging what it really means and how different the animal could be. Likewise, the perceptions vis-a-vis Chinese investment and investors, I imagine, could be different and motivated by different factors. So within this research, you include the question of whether perceptions are actually shaped by the firm's source country, meaning where the investment comes from, what's the origin, or project characteristics. And could you, again, tell us a little bit more about this fascinating research and what are your findings in this work and how eventually what do they tell us about how Latin America views Chinese investment?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for bringing up this research. This is a massive survey project that I did with my two co-authors, David Bowman from Johns Hopkins and Carrie Radigan from Amherst College. We conducted survey experiments in July last year across 10 global South countries and 20,000 respondents. And the particular project you mentioned is one of the 5 papers that we're producing. And in this paper, we designed this experiment to have respondents to choose among investment projects that we designed to understand what do they prefer in terms of attracting FDI, and do they prefer projects from a certain country. So basically, we find several very interesting things. The first thing is the Global South respondents know a lot about FDI, foreign direct investment, and they definitely have practical perspective to think about these projects. They want projects that will create jobs locally. They want projects that have good labor conditions, that have positive environmental impact, and less corruption. But one thing interesting is respondents do not mind it at all if the projects are bringing in migrant labor. So I thought that was a very interesting implication for Chinese projects. They actually don't mind that Chinese projects tend to bring in Chinese labor as well. And then,
So Ning, if I can ask you a question here, because obviously it's a visible phenomenon, but you mean that there is not much of resistance in the sense of, okay, Chinese labor will be basically taking our jobs, which is a common argument when the migrants are coming to work in certain countries. So you would say this isn't a significant factor?
for an average respondent in our survey, it seems like that's not what they care about. I think so because they want projects that create jobs, I think the mindset might be that it's fine if a project brings in foreign labor, as long as the project is also creating a lot of jobs. So, but if there is a project that foreign labor is competing with local jobs, if a project does not create enough local jobs, maybe there will be resistance. But we are surprised too by this finding.
Well, it makes sense, obviously, what you say. As long as it brings jobs for us, we don't mind someone else being here. I think the follow-up thought to that we also see in different projects is that the expectation and the performance, the labor performance, showcases a difference when it comes to Chinese labor and local labor oftentimes in terms of how much are you willing to sacrifice work, overtime hours, etc. But the logic I can feel, as long as we get what we deserve, what we want, we get the jobs, we are fine with the labor. What would be the other findings that so far you were able to trace?
Absolutely. The other finding is also very pertinent to Chinese image abroad, is that an average respondent does not actually think that Chinese projects are worse than projects from other countries. In fact, when we use a subsample, we ask respondents who know about a Chinese project nearby. They don't necessarily, not necessarily that they have visited a project, but just that they are aware of Chinese projects nearby. These people actually are more likely to think about Chinese projects positively. They believe that Chinese projects are associated with technology transfer and job creation. And they think Chinese projects actually do not involve security risks or corruption or pollution or underperformance. It's a very positive view. So this is another very interesting finding that we have. And then we also notice that when it comes to the country origin of a project, Japan is across the board by far the most favored country. Everybody wants Japanese projects. And then the second place will be almost tied between China and the United States. Projects from these two superpowers are welcomed equally across global South, with one exception, which is the Philippines, which is probably natural. Philippines has a territorial dispute with China. So in Philippines, people prefer United States project way more than China. But in general, we do not find an anti-China bias among our respondents, with the exception of Philippines and, interestingly, Brazil. Those are the only two countries where we see anti-China bias.
How interesting. And this finding of Japan, I mean, was there any specific pool of reasons why Japanese investment, the investment originating in Japan, would be the preferred one? What did you learn there?
Unfortunately, we did not ask about the mechanism. So in the next time we do the survey, we'll make sure to include that question.
But it's fascinating. It's fascinating, and especially on the second level, that there is not much of preference for Chinese or U.S. Originating investment. That's indeed quite an interesting and surprising, or maybe not that surprising, observing all of the difference of recent years. I would be personally interested in knowing how the European companies were assessed, but obviously we can leave it for the separate discussion. And meanwhile, how do you then evaluate? How could these perceptions influence the future trajectory of China-Latin America relations and the investment from China into Latin America? You mentioned the case of Brazil, but how would you assess it in the years to come, given that these perceptions, indeed, as you indicated, are not as bad as one would conventionally expect?
I think China will, for sure, in the coming years, increase its investments in Latin America. I very much think Latin America will quickly rise to be that second region in the global south, right after Southeast Asia, to be that second most important region for China for multiple reasons. One of them is that China now desperately needs to export its products abroad, overseas. And today, China is no longer producing, cheapest products. It's not toys, it's not clothes. It really needs to export phones, computers, EVs. So it needs a region with a large, steady middle class. That is Southeast Asia and South America. Africa, frankly, on that front is a little bit behind in meeting Chinese demand. So that's one reason that Chinese will continue to come to Latin America. And the second thing is there are so many natural resources in Latin America that meets China's new demand. Right now, for what China is producing, electronics, EVs, China needs a new class of minerals. Lithium, copper, nickel, magnesium. These minerals are not necessarily in Africa anymore. They really are in South America. Oh, and there is gold. Gold is so important. And South America is the largest gold mining area. So many reasons for China to go to Latin America. Our survey shows that so far, their investment projects are welcomed in this region, and Chinese projects will continue to show up. But one interesting thing, another part of our survey, shows that Chinese lending does not buy goodwill. In fact, a lot of the developing country respondents, an average respondent, will see Chinese loans coming straight from Chinese state-owned banks and governments as threatening to their sovereignty. People don't even necessarily know about the phrase debt trap, but they associate Chinese loans with characteristics that's basically saying it's a debt trap. And so in its dealing with global south, I think China probably will become more careful with lending, particularly when domestically Chinese economy is not doing well as well, but they will increase investment.
Yeah, obviously, given the economic realities, I've already heard voices now being in Beijing not long ago, especially from the mining industry, is that there is much more careful and reserved approach in terms of giving the loans, especially among the top banks. Who comes into play are more regional, local banks that are willing to support the projects, but indeed, there is an ongoing debate about the Chinese capital funding by the Chinese banks and the issues of debt trap, sovereignty, etc., etc. So for your work on perceptions of Chinese investments, obviously tied to the funding, this I imagine will be an ongoing theme. So as a last question, given this very interesting and broad range of issues that we discussed today, can I ask you, what does, in your view, Latin America need to better understand about Chinese investors, including SOEs, but not only? From your perspective, understanding the Chinese enterprises, where is there a space for Latin America to better understand the Chinese enterprises?
I think, so I've been to the region for like 12 times now, and I spent a whole 7 months in the region. One thing I do realize is that the region could use more expertise on domestic China. A lot of the times, to better understand Chinese companies, the best way is to understand where they come from. What are their status at home? What is their relationship with the Chinese government at home? What are the problems in China for them? What are they trying to escape from? All of these will actually shape their incentives when they go overseas. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity in Latin America, in academia, in journalism, in NGOs, to really start looking into domestic China. That might be helpful to understand Chinese companies in their countries.
And here I imagine that your book could indeed provide solid ground to understand what happens on the ground, because frequently, as you point out, what happens within China has consequences, repercussions on the Chinese investment elsewhere, abroad, including in Latin America, but obviously not only. So in terms of the formal conversations and formal questions, we will stop here. But this podcast has a tradition of asking for a recommendation that our speaker could make to the audience. So Ning, what would be your recommendation for us?
Absolutely. I guess I'll recommend two books that I've been reading. One is about China, one is not about China. The one about China that I really like, it came out in 2022 with Cambridge University Press. It's called Banking on Beijing, the Aims and Impacts of China's Overseas Development Program. This is co-authored. It has a team of 5 co-authors, and a lot of them are associated with A Data at William & Mary. They present new facts, new data, and they really help us understand Chinese investments and loans abroad in the entire world. Highly recommend that. And then I'll recommend a fun book. Has nothing to do with China, and it was published in 2002. It's called Salt: A World History. So this book really brilliantly presents human history through one of our key ingredients on the table, salt. Really fun.
Thank you so much. We will make sure that the links, that the reference to the sources you mentioned is in the podcast description. But now I would like to thank you very much for this very interesting conversation. I have learned a lot, and I hope our audience as well. I wish you best of luck in your research journeys, and I'll make sure to follow up on your important work of decoding China, because you have your special lens, and it's a very valuable lens for anybody that deals with the question of China and Latin America. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Monica. Thank you for having me.
Okay, here we will conclude. Thank you.